All right, we are back once again. Today we're going to look real quick at the shape tools, which is sort of the next stage moving on from the line tools. They use a lot of the same features, a lot of the same options, so this one will go a little bit quicker than when we introduce the line tools. But we are going to dive into the basic shape tools provided by Illustrator today. So we're back in Illustrator. We've opened it up from our Start menu, and I'm going to go ahead and go File, New, and again create myself an artboard. The name for this artboard is going to be Shape Tool Practice. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it at my 10-inch square artboard because that's sort of my standard for doing these practice guides. I'm going to click OK. So now on the shape tools, most of your options are going to be the same as when we did our line tools. You'll notice if I come over here to my line tools and draw a line, we get all the same. We get a bunch of options up here. Most of those are going to be the same as when we use our shape tools. So our shape tools over here on the left just have this little rectangle, and it says rectangular tool. It's got a shortcut of M. And once again, I want to remind you that it's got the little white arrow in the lower right, meaning that if you click and hold with your left mouse key, it will give you a whole section of tools that fall under this area: rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon, star, and flare. And we're going to be focusing on these first 5. The flare tool we won't really use at all in class, but the rest of them will become sort of core components. So let's go ahead and let's click on the rectangle tool. And just like the line tools, we get our little crosshair, and I can click and drag, except now instead of drawing a single line between my start and end points, it's drawing 4 because it's creating a shape. In this case, I built myself something that looks kind of like a square. It might be a little bit rectangular, but it all works out. So I'm going to come up. The stroke commands are the same as they were for the line tools. I'm going to increase the weight just to make it a little more visible what we're working with here today. So I'm going to, actually I'll jump it up to 30. And you'll notice right off the bat, we've got our path running through the center, our stroke, which in this case right now is black, going over it. Remember, the path is the actual line you drew. The stroke is kind of like the marker or the pen being used on top of it. If this were a real piece of paper, this has a real thick marker drawing over our path. Okay? And when we go to the stroke, we can again remind ourselves that we can change the corners, make them rounded, make them mitered, make them beveled or mitered. We can align the stroke to the center, to the inside, or to the outside, and back to center. It gives us all those same options. Same thing with our dashed line. We can change our patterns however we like. I'm going to make this a little bit easier to watch. Okay. And the only difference here is that now we can actually use these 2 options that change how our corners are managed when we're doing a dashed line. And play with these to see what it does. It's not that big of a deal, but just understand that now that we have a shape, we can do a dashed line. Now, you may be wondering, well, what's the point of this? I could have taken my line segment tool and drawn, using the shift key, a perfect series of lines and drawn a square. I could even have selected all of them and maybe gone up and changed them to an extended projecting cap, and we get basically a perfect shape. That one's a little off. There we go. Now we've got 2 perfect rectangles or squares. Same thing, right? Here's the difference between a shape tool shape and a shape made with the line tools. If I come over here to my line tool shape and select it and come up here to my colors, I can go ahead and I can change the border color. That's pretty easy. When I come to this one, this is our fill color. This is Illustrator saying, hey, you've got a shape. What do you want to fill that shape with? So if I take this one and I select green, well, you'll notice nothing happens. No matter how many times I click, nothing changes. That's because this is 4 separate pieces again. Okay? It's not a single shape to fill up. It's kind of like if you had a box made of wood panels and just sort of held them together and you poured water into it, the water would all leak out because it's not sealed together. In this case, using the shape tool to build this rectangular shape, it seals it together so it can be filled with something. Not necessarily water, but we can absolutely fill it with a color. So that lets us create a color and a fill for that color. So I'm going to delete all of those, and we've got our filled shape right here. Now, just like our normal work with the line tools, I'm going to go ahead and delete this, take my rectangle tool again. Just like that, I can use the Shift key to create a perfect square. I can use the Alt key to grow it from the center. I can use them in conjunction to make a perfect square starting in the center of wherever I worked. Okay. So there are a lot of features that you can manipulate, but that's our basic square. Let's go ahead and look at our second one, which in this case is the rounded rectangle tool. And we're going to just drag again. You'll notice as I drag out, there's an obvious change. Our corners are not sharp and pointy. They are in fact rounded. When I let go, you'll notice that it has rounded those corners. When I come up here and try to make them rounded or mitered, nothing happens because there isn't a sharp corner where 2 points come together for it to manipulate. So the rounded rectangle tool automatically builds these shapes. Now, if I click and drag, I have access to my Shift key to make it a perfect square, Alt key to grow it from the middle, and I now have a new option, and that's my up and down and left and right arrows. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to press the up key. And you'll notice as I press the up key, it is increasing the curve on my corners. The down key does the opposite and makes them more and more pointy. And you can in fact hold it down all the way and you suddenly get a regular rectangle. If I hold it up as far as I can and just keep going, keep going, keep going, eventually there's no straight lines at all. But we don't always like that or want that. So we want to be able to go ahead and manipulate our work as we go. So I'm going to put it sort of back halfway. And one of the other neat things is that while that was the up and down arrows, you can use left and right. Left and right take you to the two extremes. Left takes you here to zero curve. Right takes you here to as much curve as possible. And so you can go to the extremes one way or the other if you want to sort of jump from one side to the next. But that is always a way for you to manipulate these shapes as you go to create different pieces as you go. Okay? Other than that, that's the only real big difference between the rectangle and the rounded rectangle is that it allows you to create these curves as you go. I'm going to go ahead and hit delete on that. And let's look at our next tool. This is the Ellipse Tool, okay, aka the Circle Tool. Same options are applicable. Click and drag to build myself a basic shape. I can click and Alt to grow from the middle, or I can click and Shift and it grows me a perfect round circle. So again, Shift and Alt will let you grow perfectly round circles as well as grow them from the center. But ellipses are what we use to make rounded shapes as we work in Illustrator. So even though we call them ellipses, you might call them circle tools or something like that. They are officially ellipses because they're not always circles. So next up, we have the polygon tool. Now, hopefully you remember from math class that polygon is a compound word. The word poly meaning many, and the word gon meaning, well, we don't really care. All we care about is poly. So poly means many. So polygon has to do with creating a many-sided shape. And if I have the basic polygon selected and I click and drag, it creates this, a six-sided shape, which you should remember is called a hexagon. I can delete that. I can do it again. I can hold down the Shift key, and suddenly I get a perfect hexagon that's parallel to the top and bottom of my artboard. I can grow one from the center using Alt. Okay. And the Control key, again, doesn't do anything on this one. So the question is, if it creates a six-sided shape, why do we call it the polygon tool and we don't call it the hexagon tool? Well, it's because there are more modifiers that we can go into. If you'll recall, we've used Shift, Alt, Control, and our arrow keys as modifiers. In this case, for the polygon tool, the arrow keys are what we care about. If I press the up button, it's going to add a side, or technically it adds a vertex, one of these little points, and shifts the entire piece. So by clicking up many times, I've now changed it from a hexagon to a nonagon, which is a 9-sided shape. And when I start to draw my next one, it defaults to that same 9 sides. So every time I make a modification, it does go ahead and remember that. If I press down, it'll go all the way down to a 3-sided triangle. If I press up enough, it adds so many sides that it's essentially a circle. So just be aware that there's lots of ways to manipulate these, but it is a really good and easy way to create a multi-sided shape, and that's the polygon tool. And again, all the same features still apply. I can align my stroke to the in or out. I can round my corners. I can miter my corners, things like that. So these are all different pieces that work with the shape tools. I'm going to go ahead and delete those. So the last one that we want to look at is the star tool. The star tool gets a little more complicated. It's got a few more features that we need to be aware of. So with the star tool, I'm going to click and drag, and I get a basic star. Pretty straightforward, right? I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to shrink the outline just because I want you to be able to see a few details that are going to come up here. So I'm going to go ahead, here is our basic star. Here is the same basic star holding down shift. So this is our first modifier. You'll notice that if I hold shift, it creates a perfectly symmetrical work that's got 2 points straight down, 1 point straight up, so it's parallel to my board. If I press Alt, what happens there? Now that was Alt and Shift together, but here our lines are sort of at an angle. Here they're at a sharper angle. And you'll notice the big thing is that this line and this line are not the same. If I come back and I draw a line just from this point to this point, you'll notice you get an extra line. If I come over to this star and do the same thing from this point to this point, you'll notice that it's contiguous. Okay, it connects the same lines. That's what makes these two shapes different. Okay, and that's again using the Control key. So, polygon tool, regular, the Shift key, the Control key. Okay. There we go. So this again lets us build a whole bunch of different shapes with the star. Now, you'll notice these are all creating 5-pointed stars, and that may not be what we want. So I'm going to come down here, I'm going to click, I'm going to drag, and I'm going to go ahead and bring out the next two of our common modifier keys, which is up and down. As I press up, it adds a point. As I press down, it removes a point. So there's our up and down. Okay. Now, here I am holding Control while I move my mouse. So if I hold down Control and pull away, I get a pointier star. If I hold down Control and move it towards the center, I get a less pointy star. So what Control does is it allows you to change the distance between this point and this point. And how well that works depends on when you first press Control. If I press Control here, that's all I can do. But if I press Control here, as I'm building, I can get a much pointier star. So there's lots of features here. Now, why do these last two here look so weird? Well, as we work, the stroke, the size of the stroke outline has not changed, but our fill is gotten so much smaller that the stroke is sort of filling it up. If I select them both and I come down here and I reduce the stroke, you'll notice that we get our star shapes without any problems. But that's the star tool, which is part of the shape tools. Okay? So these shape tools can all work together to create basic core shapes. I'm going to go ahead and select them all and delete those. And I am going to show you this last piece, the flare tool. The flare tool is used to create a lens flare effect in Illustrator. It's all based on math. If I click and drag, there we go. That is our lens flare effect. Okay. It does a whole bunch of different things. You notice there's some streaks coming out from the center that you can sort of see here. This is used in a variety of different ways, and there are a bunch of different pieces to it. Okay. That's by clicking and releasing. You'll notice it's got a whole bunch of different options. And I know you students are going to want to play with it. That's fine. You can explore it. But it's generally not something we'll use in class because it's not you creating something. It's letting the computer create it for you. And that's not quite where we're at just yet. So I'm going to cancel that. But that is the lens tool, which is available again as part of these shape tools. So the shape tools are used to build pieces together. So one of the things that we talked about earlier this year was we talked about looking at our pictographs.